What's the scariest true story you have about being in a place that shouldn't exist? Story 1. Many years ago, my family and I moved from California to Nebraska. I was still a young kid, probably 5 to 6 years old. We were driving through Nevada, and shortly after Las Vegas, we needed to stop and fuel up. We stopped at a typical old-school gas station that rings when you pull up to the pump. I do not remember it very well, but my dad told me it looked normal. He got out to stretch while my mom went inside to pay for gas. My mom said that when she walked in, the gas station had quite a few people inside, despite us being the only car there. When she walked up to the counter to pay for gas, everyone turned to look at her, and the lights went out. She ran outside where my dad witnessed everything and helped her into the car, and we sped off down the interstate, not caring whether we ran out of gas or not. To this day, my mom says that was one of her scariest encounters because she cannot explain it or figure out exactly what was going on. And yes, we found a better gas station down the road and made it to Nebraska. Story 2. A couple of years ago, a buddy and I got turned around on a side road in rural North Missouri. I had no service for global positioning system navigation, and it was pouring rain, so I headed south toward my destination, hoping to run into a main highway. We ended up coming into the town of Skidmore, Missouri. It is a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, but there is something dark about that place. Infamously, in the 1980s, a man known as the town bully was killed in broad daylight in the middle of town there. Not one person spoke up about who killed him, and it has never been solved despite many witnesses. There have also been disappearances and a brutal crime a few years ago involving a baby being cut out of a woman's womb. Keep in mind, this is a town of only 270 people. As we drove down the main drag, several people gave us a blank but intimidating stare, which was completely unnerving. Once we got out of the town, my buddy mentioned that he had a sense of impending doom or danger as we drove through, and weirdly enough, I had been feeling the same way. I had never had such a persistent gut feeling of danger like that before, and we agreed to never ever go through Skidmore again. There is something seriously evil about that town, and it feels like it should not exist. Story 3. I have a couple, but I will choose just this one. I was driving in rural areas in New England, near the borders of Vermont and Massachusetts, so I am not sure which one I was in. It was late, well, okay, so late that it was actually early, and there was fog, dense fog, like Silent Hill levels of fog. Like an idiot who dies in the opening scene of a horror movie, I was driving on back roads. First, my headlight just went out, and I could not use high beams because of the fog. I was in the middle of nowhere, and I had not seen a house or town in a long time. The car started making noise, and the check engine light came on, so I pulled over with nothing much around except a field, fog, and darkness, which was incredibly creepy. I looked at the engine, but I can fix electronics, not engines, so I tightened all the things I knew. The car would not start, and I was stuck in the dark in the middle of nowhere, on the side of the road. Because of the natural rules of how things work, my cell phone also had no service, making it feel like one big cliche. I was not stupid enough to go wandering the roads, so I reclined my seat and decided to take a nap for a couple of hours until the sun came up. I woke up as the sun was rising and the fog was going away, and I was on the main street of a tiny town, parked in front of what looked like the Bates Motel house, with houses everywhere. It was the creepiest feeling because I was sure I had been off in the woods, and there had not been a light on in any house all night. There was a service station about 50 yards up the road, so I walked up to it and talked to the guy, who looked perfectly normal. He walked over to look at the car and asked me to try to start it, and it did, turning over right away, and both headlights were working. I drove on, never got the name of the little village, and could not find it on a map, and I have always felt like I was in a big setup for a horror movie that just did not pan out. Story 4, I was relocating across Texas, and as I normally do, I was driving through the night to skip traffic, and because it is more serene that way. I was driving straight through central Texas going northwest, so seeing the hill country change into desert under the full moon was incredible to watch. Anyway, I was driving with my now ex-wife, and we were running low on gas. Luckily, we were pulling into a tiny no-name town and could see an old gas station come around the bend. This encounter happened at about 2 in the morning. This town only had one road, and the station was right at the edge of town at the very end of it. When I say old, I mean extremely old, the type where you have no option of prepaying and you simply flip up the handle on the machine and hear the pump inside start struggling to pull gas from the reservoir. It had the old-style ticking readers too, with nothing electrical on it at all. Being the young man I was, I had never seen one before, so I walked into the store to buy the gas before I pumped. The store only had one light on in the far back, and I almost thought it was closed since it was barely brighter inside than it was outside in the moonlight. When I entered, I saw the place was deserted, with no customers, no workers, nothing. However, there was an odd tune playing on someone's radio that I could not place. An old-sounding, upbeat piano piece was playing somewhere around the corner inside, and I heard shuffling as I walked closer to the source. This place made me feel scared. Not the kind of scared where something feels creepy, but the kind where every hair stands on end and something feels seriously wrong, even though you cannot explain it. As I turned the corner, I saw a young man standing next to a large radio and dancing. His dancing was extremely off-putting and did not match the tune at all. While the radio was playing what sounded like ragtime music, he was running his hands up and down his body with his eyes closed, moving slowly in what looked like complete bliss, far slower than the music and completely off-tempo. For some reason, I could not speak or even move, and it felt like I was frozen while every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave. Finally, I managed to say that I just needed some gas. The guy kept dancing. I said it louder, and he finally slowed down and opened his eyes, focusing on me in a way that felt unsettling, almost like he was looking through me rather than at me. Without saying a word, he silently walked to the register. I told him I just needed $20 of gas. Again, he did not respond and simply stood behind the ancient register. So I assumed maybe he did not speak the language or was embarrassed that I had seen him dancing. I laid the money on the counter and went outside, hoping he would turn on the pump. I filled up the car, told my wife about the strange scene inside, and turned off the pump to stop the loud grinding noise from the interior pump fighting gravity to pull the gas upward. The strange part was that, as we were leaving, I looked back through the window and the man was still standing behind the counter, completely unmoving, with my money still sitting on the counter in front of him. It was like he had shut down the moment I left the store. A couple of months later, I was driving back to San Antonio to visit family, and we decided to stop at that old gas station during the daytime, since it had become something of a running joke between us. We pulled into the tiny town, and the station was gone. The lot it had sat on at the end of the road was not even there anymore. Just grass, with no rubble, no old pumps, no lighting, nothing at all. It looked like nothing had been there for years, as if someone had picked it up and moved it, and I still get unsettled every time I think about it. Story 5. Near my hometown, there was a hiking trail that people visited very infrequently. It ran along the side of the Niagara Escarpment, so it had climbable cliffs and a few very shallow caves that you could crawl through. I went there with some friends when I was around 19 or 20 years old, and while exploring, we found a cave that went surprisingly deep. None of us had ever been inside it before, or even noticed it before that day, but we decided to check it out even though we had no flashlights, and this was back when cell phones did not really have a flashlight function. When we stepped inside, the cave was easily 20 to 30 degrees cooler than outside. Using the limited light we had, we noticed the cave was unusually clean, with none of the empty bottles or trash that filled the other small caves in the area. After only a short time inside, we all started to feel extremely uneasy. We began hearing strange sounds and felt like we were being touched, poked, or pulled, but there was no way to tell who or what was doing it because it was so dark. We were only using lighters to see around us. At first, we were convinced one of us was messing with the others, but every time someone lit a lighter, we could see that we were all standing far apart from one another. After only a few minutes, we decided to rush out of the cave and agreed we would come back another day with proper flashlights. When we stepped back outside, it was dusk, even though it had been the middle of the day when we entered. Somehow we had lost roughly 3 hours inside that cave. We returned the following week with flashlights, but we were never able to find that cave again. Story 6. My grandparents owned a large farm when I was growing up, and all of the grandkids would help work it over the summer when we were out of school. Anytime we saw a rabbit, we were supposed to either hit it with a hoe or grab the shotgun. I was around 12 years old when I spotted a small rabbit in the bean field and did not want my grandfather to see it, so I tried to chase it away. I followed it into the brush on the property and, for some reason, kept following it, even though I usually lost sight of rabbits almost immediately once they entered the brush. I continued after it until I came across what was clearly an old barn ruin. Finding old barns like that was fairly common where I grew up, and they were always interesting to explore, so I went inside. What struck me as strange was how well maintained it was, with antique tools in excellent condition and fresh hay laid out inside. I started to worry that I had wandered onto our neighbor's land, so I quickly left and went back to my grandfather. When I told him about it, he said our land extended far beyond what I had described and that I could not have crossed the property line in the short amount of time I had been gone. He followed me back to the area, but we could not find the barn anywhere. I checked every summer after that while I worked on the farm and never found it again. It was not exactly creepy, but it always bothered me that the barn seemed to vanish without a trace. Story 7. When I was about 12 years old, my mom and I were traveling cross-country to move, and we were staying the night in Missouri at a typical roadside hotel next to an Applebee's, so we went there for dinner. It was packed, despite us being only two of the few guests staying at the hotel, so we sat at the bar. After a few seconds, we noticed something strange. Every single person had a glass of milk in front of them, including the men sitting around the bar, and there was nothing else on the counter, just tall glasses of milk. Someone opened the refrigerator under the center of the bar, and we could see it was stocked with nothing but gallons of milk. The bartender took our dinner orders and then brought each of us a glass of milk without us asking for any drinks, which felt extremely unsettling. And my mom quietly told me not to drink it. On our way back to our room, my mom stopped at the front desk and asked the woman working there, half joking and half concerned, why everyone in town seemed to drink so much milk. The woman looked confused and said she had no idea what my mom was talking about, and we left it at that. When we got to our room and started putting our leftovers in the mini fridge, we noticed there were around 10 small cartons of milk inside, with no brand name, just the word milk printed in black letters. It was a very strange place, and to this day I have never been able to figure out what was going on. Story 8. Growing up, my parents were divorced, and my dad lived on a decent piece of land with the house near the front. The backyard was a field surrounded by woods on two sides and an open pasture on the other. In the woods behind the house, there was a small river where my brother and I used to play, and we had carved out a path and even dug steps into the hillside to get down there. Most of the time we stayed near the river, but occasionally we would follow it downstream, where it opened into the neighboring field. One day, instead of going down the river, we decided to head deeper into the woods, so we packed small day bags and set off. The brush was extremely thick, and progress was slow, and eventually my brother decided to turn back because it was becoming swampy. But I kept going. After walking roughly a mile away from the river, I came across a concrete pillar surrounded by trees and undergrowth. Curious, I climbed up it, and it was about 8 feet tall, so it was not difficult. On top of the pillar, there was a hole with metal rungs leading down, and I pulled out my flashlight and climbed inside. At the bottom, which felt about 6 or 7 feet below ground, I could stand upright but barely had enough headroom, and it opened into a concrete room. It looked like someone had been living there, with a dirty sleeping bag, empty canned food, candles, books, a compact disc player, and even some yard ornaments that had been stolen from us years earlier. It terrified me, and I got out of there as fast as I could, feeling like I was being watched the entire way back to the river. I never told anyone because I was just a kid and never went back. Eventually, we stopped playing near the river altogether because it began to smell strongly like sewage, and we suspected a neighbor was dumping waste nearby that was seeping into the ground and water. Story 9. When my brother and I were 10 and 12 years old, our family went on a hike through the cemetery and into the woods not far from our house. My brothers and I explored those woods every day, had even camped there before, and knew the area extremely well. When the family reached our usual spot by the creek about halfway through the hike, my older brother and I said we would be back in a few minutes because we wanted to wander farther upstream, so we did. Not long after, we came across a very large hill that we had never seen before, covered with what looked like someone's entire household scattered everywhere, as if a house had been turned upside down, emptied, and then removed. There were painted marks on many of the trees, showing someone intended to cut them down at some point. We explored for a short time before we thought we heard our mom calling for us. So we turned around and walked maybe 20 feet back down the hill toward where our parents were. From our perspective, the whole experience lasted about 45 minutes. As soon as our mom saw us, she was furious because we had actually been gone for almost 4 hours. She never saw us walk up any hill and remembered seeing us continue straight along the creek path, not turning toward a hill that should have been nearby. She, her husband, and our other brother had searched the woods for over 4 hours calling our names and could not find us anywhere. We tried to explain and even offered to show her the hill, convinced she must have missed it. But when we went back to where the hill should have been, it was gone. For years afterward, we searched those woods, covering miles off the path, and even mapping the area as we got older, determined to find that hill again. To this day, it does not exist, and we never found the scattered furniture, toys, clothes, or other household items again, nor did we ever meet anyone who knew anything about it, which is why the experience has always stayed with me. Story 10. A group of friends and I decided to take a small Saturday afternoon road trip into the backcountry of South Carolina. We figured we would just drive around, head southwest, and see if we could find some antique shops, cemeteries, abandoned buildings, and similar places. We piled into my car and started driving, and for about an hour there was nothing but light conversation and endless southern pine forests. We passed a few horse farms, some quiet old mill towns, and a handful of gas stations, but nothing interesting yet. Around 2 in the afternoon, we decided we wanted to get something to eat. As a rule, we always liked trying local diners and small restaurants, so we kept driving until we saw a faded road sign for a town about 5 miles down the road and figured that would be good enough. As we drove into the town, we immediately noticed something was off. There were no cars on the roads, no people on the streets, and almost no real houses. The streets were lined with abandoned and boarded-up warehouses, shops with broken windows, and a few broken-down cars that looked like they had been sitting there since the 1990s. The farther we went, the worse it looked, until we finally reached a diner right off what appeared to be the main street. There were around 10 people eating inside and a few cars in the parking lot, so it seemed like the place was open. When we opened the door and stepped inside, every single person turned and stared at us. It felt like that moment in movies when the music suddenly stops and everyone looks at the newcomers, only far more uncomfortable. In the middle of the diner was a large table with 6 people sitting around it, and they briefly looked at us before turning back to their food and starting to whisper among themselves. The waitress nervously walked over and quietly asked how many people were in our group. My friend Chris answered 4 in a normal speaking voice, and everyone in the diner looked at us again. The waitress, who looked barely older than 16, flinched but led us to a table, seating us at a small table near the large one in the center. She took our drink orders and hurried away. As soon as she left, we whispered to each other about how strange everything felt. While we were talking, the line cook stood in the back staring at us with an intense, unsettling expression. After a few minutes, we decided what to order and waited in awkward silence for about 10 minutes before the waitress returned. She took our orders and disappeared into the back, leaving us alone in the dining room with the family at the other table, which gave us time to really look at them. They looked like a stereotypical Southern family: a heavy-set, tired-looking woman, a husband with sun-worn skin and oil-stained coveralls, and 3 young girls dressed in neat Sunday dresses. Then there was another woman who stood out immediately. She was dressed like the children, but looked to be in her 40s, wearing a red paisley dress with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was long, stringy, and partially covered her round face. Sitting next to her was a doll placed in a baby high chair, and the woman would occasionally lean over, whisper something to the doll, and giggle. When the waitress brought food to their table, she also placed a plate in front of the doll and commented on how pretty the woman's daughter was before walking away. When our food arrived, the waitress silently set it down, avoided eye contact, and left. She later returned to refill water at the other table, asking each person how their meal was, and even asked the doll, speaking in a soft baby voice. The woman then picked up the doll, held it in front of her face, and replied in a little girl's voice, pretending to be the doll itself. One of my friends, who worked as a therapist with deeply troubled children, looked at me with pure fear in her eyes. We quickly ate what we could, Chris left $40 on the table, and we got out of there. As we drove away, we tried to find any sign with the town's name, while also making sure we were not being followed. This happened about 6 years ago, and to this day we have never been able to find that town on a map or remember the road it was off of, even though we all clearly remember being there and what that diner looked like. Story 11. When I was in 7th grade, I had a friend who lived near a beach on a bay of Lake Michigan. One day in early May, the temperature reached 70 degrees, which was almost unheard of for that time of year in northern Wisconsin. My two friends and I rode our bikes down to the beach, excited to maybe dip our toes in the water, fully expecting it to still be freezing cold, and then spend the rest of the afternoon laying out in the sun. To our surprise, the water was warm, almost like bath water. In that area of the bay, the water stayed shallow for nearly half a mile, and we happily splashed around, wading farther and farther out until the water was about chest deep. While we were swimming and playing, I suddenly started to feel very sick, with a strong headache, nausea, and a strange, unsteady feeling. Almost immediately, my other two friends said they felt sick as well. We made our way back to shore, barely able to walk by the time we got out of the water, and collapsed under a tree where all three of us fell asleep for about 2 hours. When we woke up, we talked about how strange the whole experience was. I went back to the water and dipped my toe in, and it was ice cold. To this day, I have no idea what was in that water. I do know that there was a chemical plant in town that used to manufacture substances like Agent Orange, and their environmental practices were known to be questionable. I have never gone into that water again since that day. Story 12. A few years ago, I was driving home from Florida to Pennsylvania with three of my friends. It was late, probably sometime between 1 and 3 in the morning, and we were somewhere in North Carolina. We needed gas soon, so we agreed to take the next exit off the highway that listed a gas station. The second I took the exit, everything went completely dark. There were no street lights along the ramp or on the roads ahead, and the only light came from my headlights and the glow of Interstate 95 behind us. The darkness alone was enough to make me uneasy, especially since my vision is not great to begin with and gets much worse at night, but we really needed gas, so we kept going. While driving toward the station, the only building we passed was a massive, old-looking church. We drove by a sign saying we were entering a town, but there were no houses or businesses anywhere except for that church. When we finally reached the gas station, we noticed several enormous farm animal statues outside, towering over the lot and barely lit. They were not fenced off, and there were no signs explaining them, so if they were meant to be an attraction, it was confusing at best. Inside the gas station is where things became unsettling. On the trip with me were one other girl and two guys, all close friends for years, and while we teased each other often, we never tried to scare one another on purpose. We were all exhausted and anxious to get home. The gas station interior was huge, packed wall to wall with shelves overflowing with snacks and random items, which felt strange considering how empty the town was, but at the time we were distracted by how much merchandise there was. The other girl and I went to the restroom while the two guys paid for gas. The restrooms were difficult to access because boxes were stacked outside the doors, and the sign for the women's restroom was just a piece of paper with the word women written in green marker. As we came out, we saw one of our friends entering the men's restroom, which was also marked with a handwritten paper sign. He gave us a strange look as he went in, but we ignored it and walked toward our other friend, who we could see standing at a shelf with his back to us. As we approached, I felt a sudden, intense dread in my stomach. He turned around and gave us the most sinister expression I have ever seen, and every alarm in my head went off. Without saying anything, the other girl and I walked straight out to the car, completely confused by what had just happened. The moment we stepped outside and looked toward the pumps, we froze. Both of our friends were there. The one we had just seen entering the restroom was leaning casually against the car, and the one who had given us that terrifying look was finishing up pumping gas. We were completely stunned and asked how they could be standing outside when we had just seen them inside seconds earlier, and they looked at us like we were crazy. They told us that after paying, they had immediately gone back out to the car because the gas station felt off. Shaken and unsettled, we got back in the car and left as fast as we could. I have no explanation for why we saw what looked like duplicates of our friends inside that gas station, why they seemed angry, or why that place had giant farm animal statues outside. but I am perfectly fine never going there again because that place felt like it should not exist. Story 13. About 6 years ago, my mom, my brother, and I took a road trip from Southern California to Seattle, stopping at a few places along the way to make it a longer trip. On the way back, while driving through Oregon, it started snowing. It was around midnight, so we decided to get a room, stay the night, and head out again in the morning. We saw a really ugly sign off the freeway advertising a hotel at the next exit, so I took it. The road went up a hill, then back down into a large clearing. There was a small motel there that looked full, with cars parked in front of each room. The place was made up of several small bungalow-style units split into rooms, and almost every room had a car parked outside except for one. I went to the middle bungalow where a sign said office and walked inside. A man came out from the back, clearly just woken up. I asked for a room and he said to hold on while he took care of something in the back. As he turned away, he let out an extremely loud and unpleasant noise that echoed through the office. I started laughing, and when he came back, he looked irritated that I was laughing, handed me the key, and sent us on our way. My mom, my brother, and I went to the room and settled in for the night. The next morning around 7 o'clock, we heard a lot of noise outside, like many people talking and moving around. I looked out the window and saw no one at all, not a single person. The noise continued even though the lot was empty. We got ready and left around 7:30, still hearing people but seeing nothing. When we walked outside, we noticed the cars in the lot looked old and abandoned, rusted, some propped up on blocks, some missing windows. I went back to the office and found a different man working there, not the one from the night before. He kept asking if we were sure we did not want to stay another night. I said no and we left. We remembered seeing a McDonald's one or two exits back, so we drove there for breakfast before heading home. Along the way, we passed a sign saying there were no facilities for the next 20 miles or so, and we never saw the hotel sign again. After that trip, we made sure to only stay at large, well-known motels directly off the freeway. Story 14. Many years ago, two of my best friends and I decided to go mountain biking at Snowshoe in southern West Virginia. This was long before global positioning system navigation, so we were relying on vague directions and an old map, and we ended up getting very lost. At some point, we drove into a very small town and decided to ask for directions. The place was completely deserted, with not a single person anywhere. We parked the truck and split up to look for someone. This was around 9 to 10 in the morning, not early enough for the town to be asleep. We checked the post office, which was empty, then went into the only bar in town, which was unlocked and had music playing, but no one inside. We walked the streets and checked several businesses, and after about 25 minutes, an old man seemed to appear out of nowhere in the middle of town. The first thing we asked was not for directions, but where everyone was. He replied that people around there usually did not get up until around noon. We asked for directions to Snowshoe, and he pointed us back the way we came, saying to drive about 10 miles and make a right to reach the interstate. We left quickly, all of us feeling deeply uneasy. About 5 miles down the road, we encountered a woman in a state road uniform standing in the middle of a long, straight stretch, holding a sign. As we approached, she flipped it from slow to stop. She told us there was road construction ahead. We mentioned the strange town, and she laughed it off, saying the people there were odd. We ended up standing there talking with her for 45 minutes to an hour while waiting for traffic from the opposite direction. Not a single vehicle passed us from either direction the entire time. Eventually, she said it was clear and slowly turned the sign back to slow, motioning for us to go. We drove straight ahead for over 30 miles and never saw any construction, road workers, or equipment. She had no vehicle nearby, and we assumed she had been dropped off by a crew that never existed. After that, we had enough and headed straight for the interstate and home. Every one of us still remembers that day vividly, and when I brought it up with one of my friends at a wedding a few months ago, it still unsettled him just as much as it did back then. Story 15. A group of us were camping at a large state park with several horses. There were more people than horses, so my best friend and I went out riding alone first, then came back and switched with the larger group. At the time, we were both in our early 20s, while everyone else on the trip was in their 30s or 40s. Before they headed out, they joked about not getting lost, since it got dark quickly and we were deep in the mountains, which of course meant that when they went out, they actually did get lost. To keep it short, one of the women failed to mention that she had recently started several new medications and convinced the rest of the group to follow her down a steep deer trail. Another rider had recently had surgery and was riding a green horse and had to bail. And all of this eventually led to them calling us to come rescue them in the dark in the middle of nowhere. They initially wanted us to bring a horse trailer, but neither of us had ever driven one, and the trailers available were massive, so we took a car instead and went to find them. They said they had found a road and dropped a location pin on Google Maps, so off we went. The road was hidden just off a highway, and by then it was pitch black, with visibility only a few feet ahead. The road quickly turned to gravel and narrowed the farther we drove, then began climbing and dropping over increasingly steep hills. We joked and laughed the whole time until we came across a house. It was the kind of farmhouse that looked like it should be abandoned, half falling apart, with barbed wire and junk scattered across the yard, and a dark figure standing on the porch watching us as we approached. It could have been a person, and probably was, but it was dark enough that I could not be sure. We eventually found our group, turned the car around, and loaded in whoever needed to ride back in the vehicle. My best friend and I took turns driving and leading horses, with the car creeping along in front because the terrain was steep, the horses were tired and acting up, everyone was stressed and arguing, and we knew we would have to take the entire group onto the highway in the dark because it was the only way back to camp. I never mentioned it to anyone at the time, but when we drove back along that same road, the house was no longer there. Story 16. Where I live, there is an abandoned mental hospital, and until fairly recently, there was almost no security on the property. They are currently removing asbestos so the building can eventually be demolished. I work nearby, and one night I told my coworkers I was going to walk home and deliberately took the longer route through the woods. If you parked near the businesses close to the hospital, they would often call the police. I managed to get into an auxiliary building first, and it was one of the creepiest places I have ever been. I am a big fan of the video game Outlast, and it felt like stepping directly into that world. I eventually made my way to the main building and the auditorium, wearing protective gear so the asbestos and dust would not harm me. What made it especially unsettling was that the place had only been abandoned relatively recently, around the year 2004. So the architecture was modern and everything felt disturbingly new. There was graffiti, of course, but it felt like everyone had just suddenly left one day and never come back. Every time I looked down a hallway, I felt like something or someone was watching me. There is also a series of tunnels beneath the city that lead to the hospital, and I attempted to go down there, but my planned exit route had been filled in, likely to prevent people from entering. I turned back and walked out toward my workplace so I could call a ride home. On my way out, I was stopped by several police officers. Apparently, they had cameras on the property and took trespassing very seriously. I showed them my Florida identification card and said I was a temporary resident who had gotten lost while looking for my dog. They believed me and let me go without further trouble. Story 17. This happened when I was 13 years old, and no one in my family will acknowledge that it ever occurred. The only people who might have confirmed it have since passed away, and no one else will even discuss it with me. My family has a cabin in Cook Forest in Clarion, Pennsylvania. It was built by my great-grandfather and expanded slightly over the years, sitting at the bottom of a long dirt road off the main road and down a hill. There are a few other properties nearby, but most are farther up the dirt road, with only one partway down the hill. The cabin is very rustic, with no internet, no cell service, and a television with manual dials that you have to turn to play a digital video disc. And I loved it. From the front of the cabin, where the kitchen window, porch, parking area, and fire pit are located, you can clearly see the property halfway down the hill. For as long as anyone could remember, it was an abandoned lot with the remains of a cabin and a concrete basement built into the hillside, partially collapsed and exposed. It sat at the fork where we rode our all-terrain vehicles toward the fire break, so while it might have seemed creepy, it was familiar. Every Memorial Day weekend, our family would open the cabin for the season and gather there, arriving throughout the evening and coming together the next morning for my great-grandfather's dinosaur-shaped pancakes, which were the highlight of my childhood. That year, I woke up expecting to smell pancakes and hear everyone talking in the kitchen, but there was nothing. I assumed I had woken up too early, went downstairs to use the bathroom, and planned to go back to sleep, Though in hindsight, I should have noticed how many beds upstairs were empty. When I went outside, I saw all the adults standing in a semicircle facing an older man and woman I did not recognize. I assumed it was adult business and went back inside to wake my cousins, but not before noticing the microwave clock said it was around 3 in the afternoon. Sleeping that late was completely abnormal for me, especially at the cabin. By the time my cousins came downstairs, the adults were back inside, quiet but acting normal, and my great-grandfather started making pancakes. I noticed my aunt, who was close to me in age and usually the cool one, looked pale, so I asked her what was wrong. She took me outside and pointed to the abandoned property, which was no longer abandoned at all. In its place stood a massive cabin-like mansion with a parking area full of sport utility vehicles and the most impressive all-terrain vehicles I had ever seen. She told me the owners had come over to say hello and invited us to spend time with their nieces and nephews. I nearly ran over, but my aunt stopped me and insisted I eat first. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavy and tense, and when I asked what was wrong, my aunt asked if I had seen that building last night or in previous years, and reminded me that we had never seen any construction. A firm refusal from several adults shut down the conversation, and my grandfather later explained that something felt wrong and we should keep to ourselves. That night, I saw my great-grandfather loading 3 shotguns and handing them out, while my grandmother calmly pulled a handgun from her purse. I went to bed imagining something terrible happening. The next morning, everything felt normal again. I woke up to pancakes, saw the clock read 7:30, and was told we were not leaving until the following day because we had arrived the night before. Confused, I ran outside and saw the abandoned lot had returned to its original, crumbling state. I tried to forget it until I returned home and was called to the school office, where I was asked why I had missed school on Monday. I insisted it was Monday, only to be told it was actually Tuesday, and my absence was unexplained. To this day, no one in my family will talk about it, leaving me to wonder whether it was an elaborate trick or something far stranger. Story 18. Many years ago, a friend and I decided to visit our mutual friend at her university and spend the weekend with her. We had extremely detailed directions, and we were told the trip should take about 3 hours. Nothing went wrong on the drive itself, but it seemed to take far longer than it should have. I do not remember exactly when the woods began, but I clearly remember driving through dense forest for a very long time, easily close to an hour. By the time we finally exited the wooded area, we were already well past the 3-hour mark my friend had given us. When we reached her college town, nearly 4.5 hours had passed since we left. We did not get lost, hit traffic, or stop for more than a few minutes, and we quickly brushed it off because we were excited to spend the weekend together. When the return trip took just a little over 3 hours, we thought it was odd but did not dwell on it. It was not until my next visit that I realized how strange it really was. I spent the entire drive waiting for that long stretch of woods to appear again, but it never did. Following the exact same directions, the trip took about 3 hours, just like every visit I made in the years after. I have never been able to replicate what happened on that first drive, and I still wonder where we actually were during that stretch through the forest. Story 19. One night in rural Georgia, I experienced something that felt like an alternate reality. It did not feel creepy at the time, but as the years have passed, the memory has become more unsettling. It was late at night, and I was driving home from the Atlanta airport. Along the way, I got hungry and decided to take an exit that advertised a Waffle House. I do not remember the town name, but it was in western Georgia, maybe about an hour from Atlanta. Nearly every Waffle House is identical, with the same layout, menu, atmosphere, and no-nonsense staff, which makes them feel oddly comforting and familiar. This one was different the moment I pulled into the parking lot. The building was larger than usual, made mostly of windows, and brightly lit like a beacon in the dark. Inside, it was by far the cleanest Waffle House I had ever seen, almost glowing. Instead of the usual booths lining the walls, there were proper dining tables, and the kitchen was hidden behind a wall rather than fully visible. There were no other customers inside, which felt strange for such a place late at night. An exceptionally friendly and pleasant woman took my order, then left me alone in the bright, quiet restaurant. When she brought my food back, it was easily the best waffle I have ever eaten. I finished, paid, and continued my drive home. To this day, I have never met anyone else who remembers or has heard of that place, and I sometimes wonder if that shining Waffle House existed somewhere outside of normal reality. Story 20. When I was younger, I was not an easy kid to manage. And because of that, I ended up working on a massive ranch deep in rural Arizona. I was already an experienced horseback rider, so ranch work was not entirely new to me. While there were many positive experiences, one event has stayed with me more than any other. During cattle drives, it was not unusual to come across isolated houses, camps, or even small towns in the middle of nowhere, each with its own strange stories. On one particular drive, after being out in the desert for well over 3 weeks, we came upon a town hidden inside a canyon that looked absolutely perfect, and incredibly, it had a diner. It was a fully polished, old-style diner, the kind you would expect to see decades ago, not in the middle of the Arizona wilderness. We had not eaten a real meal in a long time, and the head wrangler had promised me a milkshake for my birthday, so I was thrilled, even though the situation felt strange. We left a few people behind to watch the cattle resting in the shade and walked into the canyon toward the diner. The moment we stepped inside, the head wrangler, an older cowboy who had spent his entire life ranching, grabbed my arm. The diner was packed, and everyone inside was dressed in clothing that looked like it belonged in the 1940s or 1950s. I was focused on the promise of a milkshake until I noticed that every single person was staring at us with expressions that felt like fear or shock. We were used to strange looks because of how dirty we were, but this felt different. Without a word, the wrangler and the others slowly backed us out of the diner and led us straight back to camp, and we left the area immediately. Later that night, once we were far away, the wrangler told me he felt like we had stepped backward in time and that the place was somehow trapped, and if we stayed, we might be trapped too. He was not a man prone to exaggeration or jokes, which made his reaction deeply unsettling. I still have no idea what that town was, but I will never forget the look on the faces of the people in that immaculate diner. Story 21. Every year or two, I take a road trip from the Midwest down to the Southwest, usually alone, passing through places like Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. On one of these trips, I was driving through New Mexico on an incredibly lonely stretch of highway and had not seen another car for at least an hour when I noticed I was down to about a quarter tank of gas. I kept going for roughly 20 to 30 miles before finally spotting a gas station. I pulled in, filled up, and decided to go inside for snacks and a bathroom break. The place was in the absolute middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but sand, rocks, and cactus. It looked very run down, which was not unusual for such a remote area, but it was built from this unsettling, damp-looking wood that seemed like it could fall apart if you kicked it. Inside, there was a small convenience store area and what could loosely be called a diner area. The moment I walked in, everyone turned to stare at me, and it was immediately clear I did not belong there. Four extremely grimy, middle-aged men sat at one of the diner tables, wearing filthy tank tops and dirty pants, staring at me without saying a word, with a disgusting spit bucket for their chewing tobacco sitting nearby. The only other person present was the clerk, a tall woman who looked rough and did not say a single word when I asked where the restroom was, only pointing down a hallway. I thanked her and started walking, immediately feeling the weight of eyes on my back. The hallway was about 10 to 15 feet long, with one working overhead light and another flickering, and both walls were completely covered in cork boards filled with missing person flyers. They dated from the 1980s up through the present, which at the time was the year 2015, and most of them were women and children. I froze a few feet into the hallway as chills washed over me and stared at the hundreds of flyers for what felt like a full minute. Then I slowly turned around and walked back toward the exit as calmly as I could, telling the clerk I had forgotten my wallet in the car. As my hand touched the door, I glanced back and realized only 3 men were now sitting at the table. Panic hit instantly. The moment I stepped outside, I ran to my car, jumped in, and sped away. It was without question the most unnerving gas station experience I have ever had. Story 22. Years ago, my dad owned a company that rented four-wheel drive vehicles to foreign travelers who wanted to explore rural Africa. The vehicles were heavily modified for off-road travel and rarely broke down, but one time a vehicle did fail, and my dad had to go retrieve it. Since we lived in a neighboring country, it was a long but manageable drive of about 20 hours. We lived in Cape Town, South Africa, and the vehicle had broken down in Namibia. To my excitement, this retrieval trip happened during a school holiday, and my dad invited me to come along. I was about 16 years old at the time and not easily scared by ghost stories, so we set off without much concern. The journey went smoothly. We reached the location, attached the broken vehicle to ours, and started heading back without issue until night fell. Namibia is known for ghost stories and abandoned places, but I had always dismissed that as fantasy. Around 2:30 in the morning, my dad woke me up, and I could hear unease in his voice. He asked me to look in the rearview mirror and tell him what I saw. I noticed two dim headlights extremely close behind us, bouncing slightly. He wanted to be sure I was seeing the same thing and not imagining it. When I looked around, the landscape was terrifying, with dark hills on either side and leafless trees forming sharp silhouettes against the night sky. I asked my dad where we were, and he said he was not sure, only that he had been following the navigation system. I checked for nearby towns and found none within 300 kilometers. My dad shifted the vehicle slightly across the center of the road, and the headlights mirrored the movement exactly. He said he thought it was a truck, which was not unusual on those roads, but something felt wrong. He slowed down significantly to let it pass, but the vehicle behind us slowed as well. Even when we dropped to very low speed, it stayed right behind us until it finally began to overtake. We heard grinding metal and chains clanging as it pulled alongside us. It was a car carrier truck with two levels, completely rusted and falling apart, held together by wood and torn fabric flapping in the wind. When I looked at the cab, it was pitch black, and there was no driver visible at all. The truck moved ahead of us and seemed unable to accelerate, so my dad carefully passed it. As we did, I kept checking the cab again, but there was still no one inside. Once we were in front of it, the headlights behind us began to fade, growing dimmer and dimmer, even as our speed increased. We approached a bend in the road on a hillside, and instead of turning, the truck continued straight off the road and down the hill. We both watched as it disappeared, the lights finally going out completely at the bottom. We stopped at a rest area for the night and returned the next morning to check if the truck was there or if anyone had been hurt. But there was nothing. No vehicle, no tracks, no damaged brush, and no sign that anything had ever gone off the road at all. Story 23. I was driving from Dallas to Tuscaloosa, having left around midnight and driven straight through the night while two friends slept in the car. It was probably around 4 in the morning, and I was down to about a quarter tank of gas, which meant roughly 100 miles left. I saw that the nearest town was about 90 miles away, and I was starting to worry I might not make it. Before reaching that town, I came across a very small place that was not on my map at all. Just a few houses, a gas station, a small convenience store, and nothing else. I walked into the gas station and handed the clerk $50 so I could fill up. He was a very tall, extremely thin black man, probably at least 6'5", with a look about him that immediately made me uneasy. He looked at me, leaned over the counter, glanced outside, then looked back at me. Instead of taking the money, he handed it back along with a hat and told me that I looked like a nice young guy. But I did not want to be out there at that time of night looking the way I did. He told me to put the hat on, get back to my car quickly, and drive to the next town for gas. From the way he said it and gestured, I got the sense he was talking about me being white, though I am not completely sure. Confused, I told him I did not have enough gas to reach the next town and that I had not even known this place existed. He calmly replied that it did not exist, and then handed me a can with about 2 gallons of gas left in it, telling me to drive another 15 to 20 miles and use that fuel, but insisting that I needed to leave immediately. At that point, I stopped questioning him and did exactly what he said. On my return trip during the daytime, I tried to stop back and return the gas can, but I could not find that town anywhere. It was as if it had completely vanished. To this day, I refuse to stop in small towns that are not marked on a map. I have no idea what that man was trying to protect me from, but the urgency in his voice and the fact that he gave me free gas to get away has stayed with me ever since. Story 24. I usually spend my summers fishing, and I almost always fish in the ocean since I live in Maine on the East Coast. One summer evening, I went fishing with my cousin, who I will call Andrew. We set up our rods on the beach before sunset, as we always did. For reasons I do not remember clearly, Andrew had to leave early that night, and since he had the car, he headed home while I decided to stay and keep fishing because the conditions were good and I had already caught one fish. About 40 minutes after sunset, all the remaining light faded from the sky and the full moon illuminated the shoreline. I went back to my seat, turned on my lamp, and started reading a book. The ocean was calm, the sky was full of stars, and the beach was completely empty, which made it peaceful, but also a little unsettling. After about an hour with no activity on my line, I decided to change bait. I carried my tackle down to the water and began reeling in one of my rods while standing ankle deep in the cold Atlantic. That is when I noticed someone crouched low in the surf, maybe 60 meters away. I was startled because there is only one main entrance to the beach, right near where I was set up, and I had not seen anyone pass by. I waved and started walking toward the figure, thinking it might be a child standing too close to the water. As I got closer, I called out, growing more concerned. In the moonlight, I realized the figure was not wearing clothes at all, but was covered in shiny gray scales. Along its back was a spine with long quills, connected by webbing, like something aquatic. I was about 15 feet away when it stood up, and where I expected a human face, I saw a long snout like a dog's and large black eyes similar to a shark's. We stared at each other in complete silence. It slowly tilted its head back, opened its mouth, and released a sound unlike anything I have ever heard, something that sounded pained and unnatural at the same time. Then it turned, waded back into the waves, and disappeared into the ocean. I stood there frozen for a long time before packing up and leaving, and I have never gone back to fish alone at night since. Story 25. I do not personally have a story like this, but I remember reading a similar one a long time ago that has stayed with me ever since. A young woman, possibly a college student or recent graduate, said she was driving home to visit her family. The trip was fairly long from where she lived, and once she became exhausted, she decided to find a hotel or motel to sleep for the night. She ended up stopping at a small, run-down motel in the middle of nowhere. She went into the lobby, gave her information, and was assigned a room. When she entered the room, she was horrified by how filthy it was, with stains everywhere, heavy grime, and even cockroaches crawling around. After seeing the condition of the room, she decided it was not worth staying inside and chose to sleep in her vehicle instead. She was driving a fairly large sport utility vehicle with tinted windows, so she folded down the back seats and tried to get some rest there. A few hours later, she woke up and noticed several men standing outside the room she had been assigned, staring in through the window. One of them appeared to be holding a flashlight. Another man, whom she recognized as the motel clerk who had taken her information and given her the room key, approached the door with a key card and quietly unlocked it. Once the door was open, all of the men rushed inside. After a few minutes, they came back out looking confused. One of them walked over to her vehicle and tried to peer inside by pressing his face against the glass, but he could not see through the tinted windows. The group stood outside talking for a short while, seemingly trying to figure out where she had gone. Hearing this, she slowly and carefully made her way to the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away as fast as she could. Shaken, she drove straight to her family's home. Once she arrived, she contacted the local police department from the town where the motel was located to report what had happened. After listening to her account, the police told her that the motel she described had shut down about a week earlier and was no longer operating. It seemed very likely that she narrowly avoided being seriously harmed that night. Story 26. On the island of Christos in Greece, there is an abandoned hotel that began construction in the late 1970s. The building was nearly finished when funding ran out, and it was ultimately abandoned and left to decay. My father and I visited my sister while she was living on the island as part of her doctoral work as a surveyor, and we decided to ride bicycles out to the hotel to explore it. Despite its condition, the place was still impressive. Weather-worn sculptures remained in place, including a massive stone horse with a girl riding it that marked the main entrance. We explored most of the rooms and walked through every floor, with graffiti covering nearly every wall. The floors were littered with broken glass and debris, though in places like the main atrium, you could still see the marble beneath. Years of exposure to the elements had left the building in severe disrepair, and it felt like somewhere no one should feel comfortable staying. After taking several photos and even recording some footage with my action camera, I decided to venture deeper into the hotel alone. I eventually reached a hallway that was almost completely dark, even though the rest of the building was flooded with bright afternoon sunlight. The hallway connected two well-lit areas, yet the center of it was pitch black for no clear reason. As I moved through it, I noticed an open door leading into a larger than normal room. When I stepped inside and used my phone's flashlight, my stomach dropped. In the middle of the room was a massive pile of shoes, all of them children's shoes. They looked old, roughly as old as the hotel itself. Scattered around the room were a few other items, such as an empty can here and a worn dress there. But the pile of children's shoes dominated the space, stretching several feet wide and a few feet high. I could not explain why it was so disturbing, but knowing they belonged to children made the scene deeply unsettling. Later, I was told that for a period of time, groups of travelers had squatted in the hotel, and the shoes were likely left behind by families who took only what they needed when they moved on. Even so, for a long time afterward, my imagination filled in far darker possibilities about what might have happened in that abandoned place. Story 27. When I was younger, I worked as a vehicle mechanic in the Army Reserves. During one overnight drill, we drove a convoy of trucks from Baltimore to Fort A.P. Hill in Virginia using old state highways. Everything started out normally, but as we drove, the convoy gradually slowed until the entire line of trucks was barely moving. We pulled over, and the driver of the lead truck said his 5-ton would not accelerate at all. We switched drivers, and sure enough, it would not go above 5 miles per hour. I was instructed to drop the truck out of the convoy, and my motor sergeant stayed with me in a pickup truck. About half an hour later, we came across an old gas station and decided to park the disabled truck there since we were not going anywhere quickly. I was told to stay with the truck until another unit could return later and transfer the equipment. After my motor sergeant drove off, I found myself alone in a very remote part of southern Maryland with no one else around. As it got dark, I noticed the lights were on at the gas station and that the attached restaurant appeared to be open. I was extremely hungry, so I went inside and sat in a booth by the window where I could keep an eye on the truck. A woman came over and asked what I wanted to eat. When I asked for a menu, she told me they did not have one but offered fried chicken and mashed potatoes, which sounded great. I was starving, and it was some of the best fried chicken I had ever eaten. After finishing, I left the money on the table and went back outside to the truck. I stayed awake for a while, then eventually laid across the seat and fell asleep. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, another truck arrived with several soldiers, and we began transferring the gear. One of the guys joked that I must be starving, and I told him I had eaten at the restaurant. He gave me a strange look and said that I had not eaten there, and told me to really look at the building. Since it was dark and hard to see, I brushed it off and assumed he was joking. A few hours later in the morning, we returned to deal with the broken-down truck, and that is when I realized something was very wrong. The gas station was completely boarded up, and it looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Feeling deeply unsettled, I walked over and peeked through the uncovered glass in the door, and my money was still sitting on the table exactly where I had left it. I got away from that place as fast as I could. Story 28. About 30 years ago, I went bear hunting in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan with around 6 other men. One night at a bar, a local told us about a ghost town, which I believe was called Pauline, located about 15 miles down old logging roads. We decided to check it out, and when we arrived, it looked like everyone had packed up whatever they could fit into a vehicle and left. There was a main street lined with houses from the late 1940s and early 1950s, and remarkably, all the windows and doors were still intact, making it look like you could move right in. At the top of the street was what appeared to be an abandoned copper mine building with a massive hole in the floor. When we dropped rocks into it, it took roughly 40 seconds before we heard them splash at the bottom. I remember seeing around 40 to 50 houses along with the mine buildings, and everyone I have spoken to since remembers it much the same way. Years later, a friend of mine whose son attends Michigan Technological University in Houghton asked around about it. He spoke to locals and campus history experts, but no one had ever heard of the town, and no records of it could be found. You can even follow the logging road we took on satellite imagery all the way from the paved road to Misery Bay on Lake Superior, and there is no trace of a town or clearing of that size ever existing. I still do not know what to make of it. One of the men claims he has photographs somewhere, but I am still waiting to see them.